laid his head upon her bosom, put a hand upon his head, and resting her cheek upon that hand, nursed him as lovingly, and God knows as innocently, as she had nursed her father in that room when she had been but a baby, needing all the care from others that she took of them. When he could speak, he said, "Is it possible that you have come to me, and in this dress? I hoped you would like me better in this dress than any other. I have always kept it by me to remind me, though I wanted no reminding. I am not alone, you see. I have brought an old friend with me." Looking round, he saw Maggie in her big cap, which had been long abandoned with a blanket on her arm as in the bygone days, chuckling rapturously. "It was only yesterday evening that I came to London with my brother. I sent round to Mrs. Plornish almost as soon as we arrived, that I might hear of you and let you know I had come. Then I heard that you were here. Did you happen to think of me in the night? I almost believe you must have thought of me a little. I thought of you so anxiously, and it appeared so long to morning." "I have thought of you." He hesitated what to call her. She perceived it in an instant. "You have not spoken to me by my right name yet. You know what my right name always is with you." "I have thought of you, little Dorrit, every day, every hour, every minute since I have been here." "Have you? Have you?" He saw the bright delight of her face and the flush that kindled in it with a feeling of shame. He, a broken, bankrupt, sick, dishonoured prisoner. "I was here before the gates were opened, but I was afraid to come straight to you. I should have done you more harm than good at first, for the prison was so familiar and yet so strange, and it brought back so many remembrances of my poor father, and of you too, that at first it overpowered me. But we went to Mr. Chivery before we came to the gate, and he brought us in, and got John's room for us, my poor old room, you know, and we waited there a little. I brought the flowers to the door, but you didn't hear me." She looked something more than womanly when she had gone away, and the ripening touch of the Italian sun was visible upon her face. But otherwise she was quite unchanged. The same deep, timid earnestness that he had always seen in her, and never without emotion, he saw still. If it had a new meaning that smote him to the heart, the change was in his perception, not in her. She took off her old bonnet, hung it in the old place, and noiselessly began, with Maggie's help, to make his room as fresh and neat as it could be made, and to sprinkle it with a pleasant-smelling water. When that was done, the basket, which was filled with grapes and other fruit, was unpacked, and all its contents were quietly put away. When that was done, a moment's whisper dispatched Maggie to dispatch somebody else to fill the basket again, which soon came back replenished with new stores, from which a present provision of cooling drink and jelly, and a prospective supply of roast chicken and wine and water were the first extracts. These various arrangements completed, she took out her old needle-case to make him a curtain for his window, and thus, with a quiet reigning in the room that seemed to diffuse itself through the else noisy prison, he found himself composed in his chair, with little Dorrit working at his side. To see the modest head again bent over its task, and the nimble fingers busy at their old work, though she was not so absorbed in it, but that her compassionate eyes were often raised to his face, and, when they drooped again, had tears in them, to be so consoled and comforted, and to believe that all the devotion of this great nature was turned to him in his adversity to pour out its inexhaustible wealth of goodness upon him, did not steady Clennam's trembling voice or hand, or strengthen him in his weakness. Yet it inspired him with an inward fortitude that rose with his love. And how dearly he loved her now, what words can tell? As they sat side by side in the shadow of the wall, the shadow fell like light upon him. She would not let him speak much, and he lay back in his chair looking at her. Now and again she would rise and give him the glass that he might drink, or would smooth the resting place of his head. Then she would gently resume her seat by him and bend over her work again. The shadow moved with the sun, but she never moved from his side except to wait upon him. The sun went down, and she was still there. She had done her work now, and her hand, faltering on the arm of his chair since its last tending of him, was hesitating there yet. He laid his hand upon it, and it clasped him with a trembling supplication. "Dear Mr. Clennam, I must say something to you before I go. I have put it off from hour to hour, but I must say it." "I too, dear little Dorrit. I have put off what I must say." She nervously moved her hand towards his lips as if to stop him, then it dropped trembling into its former place. "I am not going abroad again. My brother is, but I am not. He was always attached to me, and he is so grateful to me now, so much too grateful, for it is only because I happen to be with him in his illness that he says I shall be free to stay where I like best, and to do what I like best. He only wishes me to be happy, he says." There was one bright star shining in the sky. She looked up at it while she spoke, as if it were the fervent purpose of her own heart shining above her. "You will understand, I dare say, without my telling you, that my brother has come home to find my dear father's will, and to take possession of his property. He says if there is a will, he is sure I shall be left rich, and if there is none, that he will make me so." He would have spoken, but she put up her trembling hand again, and he stopped. "I have no use for money. I have no wish for it. It would be of no value to me at all, but for your sake. I could not be rich and you here. I must always be much worse than poor, with you distressed. Will you let me lend you all I have? Will you let me give it to you? Will you let me show you that I have never forgotten, that I never can forget your protection of me when this was my home? Dear Mr. Clennam, make me of all the world the happiest by saying yes. Make me as happy as I can be in leaving you here, by saying nothing tonight, and letting me go away with the hope that you will think of it kindly, and that you, for my sake, not for yours, for mine, for nobody's but mine, you will give me the greatest joy I can experience on earth, the joy of knowing that I have been serviceable to you, and that I have paid some little of the great debt of my affection and gratitude. I can't say what I wish to say. I can't visit you here where I have lived so long. I can't think of you here where I have been so much, and be as calm and comforting as I ought. My tears will make their way. I cannot keep them back. But pray, 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 do not turn from your little Dorrit now in your affliction. Pray, 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 I beg you and I implore you with all my grieving heart, my friend, my dear, take all I have and make it a blessing to me." The star had shone on her face until now, when her face sank upon his hand and her own. It had grown darker when he raised her in his encircling arm and softly answered her, "No, darling little Dorrit. No, my child, I must not hear of such a sacrifice. Liberty and hope would be so dear, bought at such a price, that I could never support their weight, never bear the reproach of possessing them. But with what ardent thankfulness and love I say this, I may call heaven to witness. And yet you will not let me be faithful to you in your affliction? Say, dearest little Dorrit, and yet I will try to be faithful to you. If in the bygone days when this was your home, and when this was your dress, I had understood myself, I speak only of myself, better, and had read the secrets of my own breast more distinctly, if, through my reserve and self-mistrust, I had discerned a light that I see brightly now when it has passed far away, and my weak footsteps can never overtake it, if I had then known and told you that I loved and honoured you, not as the poor child I used to call you, but as a woman whose true hand would raise me high above myself and make me a far happier and better man, if I had so used the opportunity, there is no recalling, as I wish I had, oh, I wish I had, and if something had kept us apart then, when I was moderately thriving, and when you were poor, I might have met your noble offer of your fortune, dearest girl, with other words than these, and still have blushed to touch it. But, as it is, I must never touch it, never." She besought him more pathetically and earnestly, with a little supplicatory hand, than she could have done in any words. "I am disgraced enough, my little Dorrit. I must not descend so low as that, and carry you, so dear, so generous, so good, down with me. God bless you. God reward you. It is past." He took her in his arms as if she had been his daughter. "Always so much older, so much rougher, and so much less worthy, even what I was must be dismissed by both of us, and you must see me only as I am. I put this parting kiss upon your cheek, my child, who might have been more near to me, who never could have been more dear, a ruined man, far removed from you, for ever separated from you, whose course is run while yours is but beginning. I have not the courage to ask to be forgotten by you in my humiliation, but I ask to be remembered only as I am. The bell began to ring, warning visitors to depart. He took her mantle from the wall and tenderly wrapped it round her. One other word, my little Dorrit. A hard one to me, but it is a necessary one. The time when you and this prison had anything in common has long gone by. Do you understand? Oh, you will never say to me, she cried, weeping bitterly and holding up her clasped hands in entreaty, that I am not to come back any more? You will surely not desert me so? I would say it if I could, but I have not the courage quite to shut out this dear face and abandon all hope of its return. But do not come soon, do not come often. This is now a tainted place, and I well know the taint of it clings to me. You belong to much brighter and better scenes. You are not to look back here, my little Dorrit. You are to look away to very different and much happier paths. Again, God bless you in them. God reward you. Maggie, who had fallen into very low spirits here, cried, "Oh, get him into a hospital. Do get him into a hospital, mother. He'll never look like himself again if he ain't got into a hospital. And then the little woman as was always a-spinning at her wheel, she can go to the cupboard with the princess and say, 'What do you keep the chicken there for?' And they can take it out and give it to him, and then all be happy." The interruption was seasonable, for the bell had nearly rung itself out. Again tenderly wrapping her mantle about her, and taking her on his arm, though but for her visit he was almost too weak to walk, Arthur led little Dorrit downstairs. She was the last visitor to pass out at the lodge, and the gate jarred heavily and hopelessly upon her. With the funeral clang that it sounded into Arthur's heart, his sense of weakness returned. It was a toilsome journey upstairs to his room, and he re-entered its dark, solitary precincts in unutterable misery. When it was almost midnight, and the prison had long been quiet, a cautious creak came up the stairs, and a cautious tap of a key was given at his door. It was young John. He glided in his stockings, and held the door closed, while he spoke in a whisper. "It's against all rules, but I don't mind. I was determined to come through and come to you." "What is the matter?" "Nothing's the matter, sir. I was waiting in the courtyard for Miss Dorrit when she came out. I thought you'd like someone to see that she was safe." Thank you. You took her home, John?" "I saw her to her hotel, the same that Mr. Dorrit was at. Miss Dorrit walked all the way and talked to me so kind, it quite knocked me over. Why do you think she walked instead of riding?" "I don't know, John." "To talk about you. She said to me, 'John, you was always honourable, and if you'll promise me that you'll take care of him and never let him want for help and comfort when I'm not there, my mind will be at rest so far.' I promised her, and I'll stand by you," said John Chivery, "forever." Clennam, much affected, stretched out his hand to this honest spirit. "Before I take it," said John, looking at it without coming from the door, "guess what message Miss Dorrit gave me?" Clennam shook his head. "Tell him," repeated John, in a distinct though quavering voice, "that his little Dorrit sent him her undying love. Now it's delivered. Have I been honourable, sir?" "Very, very." "Will you tell Miss Dorrit I've been honourable, sir?" "I will, indeed." "There's my answer," said John, "and I'll stand by you forever." After a hearty squeeze, he disappeared with the same cautious creak upon the stair, crept shoeless over the pavement of the yard, and, locking the gates behind him, passed out into the front where he had left his shoes. If the same way had been paved with burning ploughshares, it is not at all improbable that John would have traversed it with the same devotion, for the same purpose. Chapter 30. Closing in. The last day of the appointed week touched the bars of the Marshalsea gate. Black, all night, since the gate had clashed upon little Dorrit, its iron stripes were turned by the early glowing sun into stripes of gold. Far aslant across the city, over its jumbled roofs and through the open tracery of its church towers, struck the long bright rays, bars of the prison of this lower world. Throughout the day the old house within the gateway remained untroubled by any visitors. But when the sun was low, 3 men turned in at the gateway and made for the dilapidated house. Rigaud was the first, and walked by himself smoking. Mr. Baptiste was the second, and jogged close after him, looking at no other object. Mr. Panks was the third, and carried his hat under his arm for the liberation of his restive hair, the weather being extremely hot. They all came together at the doorsteps. "You pair of madmen," said Rigaud, facing about. "Don't go yet." "We don't mean to," said Mr. Panks, giving him a dark glance in acknowledgment of his answer. Rigaud knocked loudly. He had charged himself with drink for the playing out of his game, and was impatient to begin. He had hardly finished one long resounding knock when he turned to the knocker again and began another. That was not yet finished when Jeremiah Flintwinch opened the door, and they all clanked into the stone hall. Rigaud, thrusting Mr. Flintwinch aside, proceeded straight upstairs. His 2 attendants followed him. Mr. Flintwinch followed them, and they all came trooping into Mrs. Clennam's quiet room. It was in its usual state, except that one of the windows was wide open, and Affery sat on its old-fashioned window-seat, mending a stocking. The usual articles were on the little table. The usual deadened fire was in the grate. The bed had its usual pall upon it, and the mistress of all sat on her black bier-like sofa, propped up by her black angular bolster that was like the headsman's block. Yet there was a nameless air of preparation in the room, as if it were strung up for an occasion. From what the room derived it, every one of its small variety of objects being the fixed spot it had occupied for years, no one could have said without looking attentively at its mistress, and that, too, with a previous knowledge of her face. Although her unchanging black dress was in every plait precisely as of old, and her unchanging attitude was rigidly preserved, a very slight additional setting of her features and contraction of her gloomy forehead was so powerfully marked that it marked everything about her. "Who are these?" she said wonderingly, as the 2 attendants entered. "What do these people want here?" "Who are these, dear madame, is it?" returned Rigaud. "Faith, they are friends of your son the prisoner. And what do they want here, is it? Death, madam, I don't know. You will do well to ask them." "You know you told us at the door not to go yet," said Panks. "And you know you told me at the door you didn't mean to go," retorted Rigaud. "In a word, madam, permit me to present 2 spies of the prisoners. Madmen, but spies. If you wish them to remain here during our little conversation, say the word. It is nothing to me." "Why should I wish them to remain here?" said Mrs. Clennam. "What have I to do with them?" "Then, dearest madame," said Rigaud, throwing himself into an armchair so heavily that the old room trembled, "you will do well to dismiss them. It is your affair. They are not my spies, not my rascals." "Hark, you, Panks," said Mrs. Clennam, bending her brows upon him angrily. "You, Casby's clerk, attend to your employer's business and your own. Go, and take that other man with you." "Thank you, ma'am," returned Mr. Panks. "I am glad to say I see no objection to our both retiring. We have done all we undertook to do for Mr. Clennam. His constant anxiety has been, and it grew worse upon him when he became a prisoner, that this agreeable gentleman should be brought back here, to the place from which he slipped away. Here he is, brought back, and I will say," added Mr. Panks, to his ill-looking face that, in my opinion, the world would be no worse for his slipping out of it altogether. Your opinion is not asked, answered Mrs. Clennam. Go. I am sorry not to leave you in better company, ma'am, said Pancks, and sorry, too, that Mr. Clennam can't be present. It's my fault, that is. You mean his own, she returned. No, I mean mine, ma'am, said Pancks, for it was my misfortune to lead him into a ruinous investment. Mr. Pancks still clung to that word, and never said speculation, though I can prove by figures, added Mr. Pancks, with an anxious countenance, that it ought to have been a good investment. I have gone over it since it failed every day of my life, and it comes out, regarded as a question of figures, triumphant. The present is not a time or place, Mr. Pancks pursued, with a longing glance into his hat where he kept his calculations, for entering upon the figures, but the figures are not to be disputed. Mr. Clennam ought to have been at this moment in his carriage and pair, and I ought to have been worth from £3,000 to £5,000. Mr. Pancks put his hair erect, with a general aspect of confidence that could hardly have been surpassed if he had had the amount in his pocket. These incontrovertible figures had been the occupation of every moment of his leisure since he had lost his money, and were destined to afford him consolation to the end of his days. However, said Mr. Pancks, enough of that. Outro, old boy, you have seen the figures, and you know how they come out. Mr. Baptiste, who had not the slightest arithmetical power of compensating himself in this way, nodded with a fine display of bright teeth, at whom Mr. Flintwich had been looking, and to whom he then said, Oh, it's you, is it? I thought I remembered your face, but I wasn't certain till I saw your teeth. Ah, yes, to be sure. It was this officious refugee, said Jeremiah to Mrs. Clennam, who came knocking at the door on the night when Arthur and Chatterbox were here, and who asked me a whole catechism of questions about Mr. Blondois. It is true, Mr. Baptiste cheerfully admitted, and behold him, padrone, I have found him consequentementally. I shouldn't have objected, returned Mr. Flintwich, to your having broken your neck consequentementally. And now, said Mr. Pancks, whose eye had often stealthily wandered to the window-seat and the stocking that was being mended there, I've only one other word to say before I go. If Mr. Clennam was here, but unfortunately, though he has so far got the better of this fine gentleman as to return him to this place against his will, he is ill and in prison, poor fellow. If he was here, said Mr. Pancks, taking one step aside towards the window-seat, and laying his right hand upon the stocking, he would say, Affery, tell your dreams. Mr. Pancks held up his right forefinger between his nose and the stocking, with a ghostly air of warning, turned, steamed out, and towed Mr. Baptiste after him. The house door was heard to close upon them, their steps were heard passing over the dull pavement of the echoing courtyard, and still nobody had added a word. Mrs. Clennam and Jeremiah had exchanged a look, and had then looked and looked still at Affery, who sat mending the stocking with great assiduity. Come, said Mr. Flintwich at length, screwing himself a curve or two in the direction of the window-seat, and rubbing the palms of his hands on his coat-tail as if he were preparing to do something. Whatever has to be said among us had better be begun to be said without more loss of time. So, Affery, my woman, take yourself away. In a moment Affery had thrown the stocking down, started up, caught hold of the window-sill with her right hand, lodged herself upon the window-seat with her right knee, and was flourishing her left hand, beating expected assailants off. No, I won't, Jeremiah, no, I won't. No, I won't go. I'll stay here. I'll hear all I don't know and say all I know. I will at last if I die for it. I will. Mr. Flintwich, stiffening with indignation and amazement, moistened the fingers of one hand at his lips, softly described a circle with them in the palm of the other hand, and continued with a menacing grin to screw himself in the direction of his wife, gasping some remark as he advanced, of which, in his choking anger, only the words, "Such a dose," were audible. "Not a bit nearer, Jeremiah," cried Affery, never ceasing to beat the air. "Don't come a bit nearer to me, or I'll rouse the neighborhood. I'll throw myself out of window. I'll scream fire and murder. I'll wake the dead. Stop where you are, or I'll make shrieks enough to wake the dead." The determined voice of Mrs. Clennam echoed, "Stop!" Jeremiah had stopped already. "It is closing in, Flintwitch. Let her alone. Affery, do you turn against me after these many years?" "I do, if it's turning against you to hear what I don't know and say what I know. I've broken out now, and I can't go back. I am determined to do it. I will do it. I will. If that's turning against you, yes, I turn against both of you, you two clever ones. I told Arthur when he first come home to stand up against you. I told him it was no reason because I was afeard of my life of you that he should be. All manner of things have been a-going on since then, and I won't be run up by Jeremiah, nor yet I won't be dazed and scared, nor made a party to I don't know what no more. I won't. I'll up for Arthur when he has nothing left, and is ill and in prison and can't up for himself. I will. "How do you know, you heap of confusion," asked Mrs. Clennam sternly, "that in doing what you are doing now, you are even serving Arthur?" "I don't know nothing rightly about anything," said Affery, "and if ever you said a true word in your life, it's when you call me a heap of confusion, for you two clever ones have done your most to make me such. You married me whether I liked it or not, and you've led me pretty well ever since. Such a life of dreaming and frightening as never was known, and what do you expect me to be but a heap of confusion? You wanted to make me such, and I am such, but I won't submit no longer. No, I won't. She was still beating the air against all comers. After gazing at her in silence, Mrs. Clennam turned to Rigaud. "You see and hear this foolish creature. Do you object to such a piece of distraction remaining where she is?" "Aye, madame," he replied. "Do I? That's a question for you." "I do not," she said gloomily. "There is little left to choose now. Flintwitch, it is closing in." Mr. Flintwitch replied by directing a look of red vengeance at his wife, and then, as if to pinion himself from falling upon her, screwed his crossed arms into the breast of his waistcoat, and with his chin very near one of his elbows stood in a corner, watching Rigaud in the oddest attitude. Rigaud, for his part, arose from his chair and seated himself on the table with his legs dangling. In this easy attitude he met Mrs. Clennam's set face, with his moustache going up and his nose coming down. "Madame, I am a gentleman." "Of whom," she interrupted in her steady tones, "I have heard disparagement in connection with a French jail and an accusation of murder." He kissed his hand to her with his exaggerated gallantry. "Perfectly, exactly. Of a lady, too. What absurdity! How incredible! I had the honor of making a great success then. I hope to have the honor of making a great success now. I kiss your hands, madame. I am a gentleman, I was going to observe, who, when he says, 'I will definitely finish this or that affair at the present sitting,' does definitely finish it. I announce to you that we are arrived at our last sitting on our little business. You do me the favor to follow and to comprehend." She kept her eyes fixed upon him with a frown. "Yes. Further, I am a gentleman of the softest and sweetest disposition, but who, if trifled with, becomes enraged. Noble creatures under such circumstances become enraged. I possess a noble nature. When the lion is awakened, that is to say, when I enrage, the satisfaction of my animosity is as acceptable to me as money. You always do me the favor to follow and to comprehend." "Yes," she answered, somewhat louder than before. "Do not let me derange you. Pray be tranquil. I have said we are now arrived at our last sitting. Allow me to recall the 2 sittings we have held." "It is not necessary." "Death, madam," he burst out. "It's my fancy. Besides, it clears the way. The first sitting was limited. I had the honor of making your acquaintance, of presenting my letter. I am a knight of industry at your service, madame, but my polished manners had won me so much of success as a matter of languages among your compatriots, who are as stiff as their own starch is to one another, but are ready to relax to a foreign gentleman of polished manners, and of observing one or two little things. He glanced around the room and smiled. About this honourable house, to know which was necessary to assure me and to convince me that I had the distinguished pleasure of making the acquaintance of the lady I sought. I achieved this. I gave my word of honour to our dear Flintwich that I would return. I gracefully departed. Her face neither acquiesced nor demurred. The same when he paused, and when he spoke, it as yet showed him always the one attentive frown, and the dark revelation before mentioned of her being nerved for the occasion. I say gracefully departed, because it was graceful to retire without alarming a lady. To be morally graceful not less than physically is a part of the character of Rigaud Blondois. It was also politic, as leaving you with something overhanging you, to expect me again with a little anxiety on a day not named. But your slave is politic. By heaven, madame, politic, let us return. On the day not named, I have again the honour to render myself at your house. I intimate that I have something to sell, which, if not bought, will compromise madame, whom I highly esteem. I explain myself generally. I demand, I think it was £8,000, will you correct me? Thus, forced to speak, she replied with constraint. You demanded as much as £1,000. I demand at present 2. Such are the evils of delay. But to return once more, we are not accordant, we differ on that occasion. I am playful. Playfulness is a part of my amiable character. Playfully I become as one slain and hidden. For it may alone be worth half the sum to madame to be freed from the suspicions that my droll idea awakens. Accident and spies intermix themselves against my playfulness and spoil the fruit, perhaps, who knows? Only you and Flintwich, when it is just ripe. Thus, madame, I am here for the last time. Listen, definitely the last. As he struck his straggling boot heels against the flap of the table, meeting her frown with an insolent gaze, he began to change his tone for a fierce one. Bah, stop an instant. Let us advance by steps. Here is my hotel note to be paid according to contract. 5 minutes hence we may be at dagger's point. I'll not leave it till then, or you'll cheat me. Pay it. Count me the money. Take it from his hand and pay it, Flintwich, said Mrs. Clennam. He spirited into Mr. Flintwich's face when the old man advanced to take it, and held forth his hand, repeating noisily, Pay it, count it out, good money. Jeremiah picked the bill up, looked at the total with a bloodshot eye, took a small canvas bag from his pocket, and told the amount into his hand. Rigaud chinked the money, weighed it in his hand, threw it up a little way and caught it, chinked it again. The sound of it to the bold Rigaud Blondois is like the taste of fresh meat to the tiger. Say then, madame, how much? He turned upon her suddenly, with a menacing gesture of the weighted hand that clenched the money as if he were going to strike her with it. I tell you again, as I told you before, that we are not rich here, as you suppose us to be, and that your demand is excessive. I have not the present means of complying with such a demand, if I had ever so great an inclination. If, cried Rigaud, hear this lady with her if, will you say that you have not the inclination? I will say what presents itself to me, and not what presents itself to you. Say it, then. As to the inclination, quick, come to the inclination and know what to do. She was no quicker and no slower in her reply. It would seem that you have obtained possession of a paper or of papers which I assuredly have the inclination to recover. Rigaud, with a loud laugh, drummed his heels against the table and chinked his money. I think so. I believe you there. The paper might be worth to me a sum of money. I cannot say how much or how little." "What the devil?" he asked savagely. "Not after a week's grace to consider?" "No, I will not out of my scanty means, for I tell you again we are poor here, not rich. I will not offer any price for a power that I do not know the worst and the fullest extent of. This is the third time of your hinting and threatening. You must speak explicitly, or you may go where you will and do what you will. It is better to be torn to pieces at a spring than to be a mouse at the caprice of such a cat." He looked at her so hard with those eyes too near together that the sinister sight of each crossing that of the other seemed to make the bridge of his hooked nose crooked. After a long survey, he said, with the further setting off of his internal smile, "You are a bold woman." "I am a resolved woman." "You always were, what?" "She always was. Is it not so, my little Flintwitch?" "Flintwitch, say nothing to him. It is for him to say here and now all he can, or to go hence and do all he can. You know this is to be our determination. Leave him to his action on it." She did not shrink under his evil leer or avoid it. He turned it upon her again. She remained steady at the point to which she had fixed herself. He got off the table, placed a chair near the sofa, sat down in it, and leaned an arm upon the sofa close to her own, which he touched with his hand. Her face was ever frowning, attentive, and settled. "It is your pleasure, then, madame, that I shall relate a morsel of family history in this little family society," said Rigaud, with a warning play of his lithe fingers on her arm. "I am something of a doctor. Let me touch your pulse." She suffered him to take her wrist in his hand. Holding it, he proceeded to say, "A history of a strange marriage and a strange mother, and a revenge and a suppression. Aye, this pulse is beating curiously. It appears to me that it doubles while I touch it. Are these the usual changes of your malady, madame?" There was a struggle in her maimed arm as she twisted it away, but there was none in her face. On his face there was his own smile. "I have lived an adventurous life. I am an adventurous character. I have known many adventurers, interesting spirits, amiable society. To one of them I owe my knowledge and my proofs. I repeat it, estimable lady, proofs of the ravishing little family history I go to commence. You will be charmed with it. But, I forgot. One should name a history. Shall I name it the history of a house? But, again, there are so many houses. Shall I name it the history of this house?" Leaning over the sofa, poised on two legs of his chair and his left elbow, that hand often tapping her arm to beat his words home, his legs crossed, his right hand sometimes arranging his hair, sometimes smoothing his moustache, sometimes striking his nose, always threatening her whatever he did, coarse, insolent, rapacious, cruel, and powerful, he pursued his narrative at his ease. "In fine, then, I name it the history of this house. I commence it. There live here, let us suppose, an uncle and a nephew. The uncle, a rigid old gentleman of strong force of character. The nephew, habitually timid, repressed, and under constraint." Mistress Affery, fixedly attentive in the window-seat, biting the rolled-up end of her apron and trembling from head to foot, here cried out, "Jeremiah, keep off me. I've heard in my dreams of Arthur's father and his uncle. He's a-talking of them. It was before my time here, but I've heard in my dreams that Arthur's father was a poor, irresolute, frightened chap, who had had everything but his orphan life scared out of him when he was young, and that he had no voice in the choice of his wife even, but his uncle chose her. There she sits. I heard it in my dreams, and you said it to your own self." As Mr. Flintwich shook his fist at her, and as Mrs. Clennam gazed upon her, Rigaud kissed his hand to her. "Perfectly right, dear Madame Flintwich. You have a genius for dreaming. I don't want none of your praises, returned Affery. I don't want to have nothing at all to say to you. But Jeremiah said they was dreams, and I'll tell 'em as such. Here she put her apron in her mouth again, as if she were stopping somebody else's mouth, perhaps Jeremiah's, which was chattering with threats as if he were grimly cold. "Oh, beloved Madame Flintwitch," said Rigaud, "developing all of a sudden a fine susceptibility and spirituality is right to marvel. Yes, so runs the history. Monsieur the uncle commands the nephew to marry. Monsieur says to him, in effect, 'My nephew, I introduce you to a lady of strong force of character, like myself. A resolved lady, a stern lady, a lady who has a will that can break the weak to powder, a lady without pity, without love, implacable, revengeful, cold as the stone, but raging as the fire.' Ah, what fortitude! Ah, what superiority of intellectual strength! Truly a proud and noble character that I describe in the supposed words of Monsieur the uncle. Death of my soul, I love the sweet lady." Mrs. Clennam's face had changed. There was a remarkable darkness of colour on it, and the brow was more contracted. "Madame, madame," said Rigaud, tapping her on the arm as if his cruel hand were sounding a musical instrument, "I perceive I interest you. I perceive I awaken your sympathy. Let us go on." The drooping nose and the ascending moustache had, however, to be hidden for a moment with the white hand before he could go on. He enjoyed the effect he made so much. "The nephew being, as the lucid Madame Flintwitch has remarked, a poor devil, who has had everything but his orphan life frightened and famished out of him. The nephew abases his head and makes response, 'My uncle, it is to you to command. Do as you will.' Monsieur the uncle does as he will. It is what he always does. The auspicious nuptials take place. The newly married come home to this charming mansion. The lady is received, let us suppose, by Flintwitch. Eh, old intriguer?" Jeremiah, with his eyes upon his mistress, made no reply. Rigaud looked from one to the other, struck his ugly nose, and made a clucking with his tongue. Soon the lady makes a singular and exciting discovery. Thereupon, full of anger, full of jealousy, full of vengeance, she forms, see you, madame, a scheme of retribution, the weight of which she ingeniously forces her crushed husband to bear himself, as well as execute upon her enemy. What superior intelligence! "Keep off, Jeremiah," cried the palpitating Affery, taking her apron from her mouth again. "But it was one of my dreams that you told her. When you quarrelled with her one winter evening at dusk, there she sits and you looking at her, that she oughtn't to have let Arthur, when he come home, suspect his father only, that she had always had the strength and power, and that she ought to have stood up more to Arthur for his father. It was in the same dream where you said to her that she was not something, but I don't know what, for she burst out tremendous and stopped you. You know the dream as well as I do. When you come downstairs into the kitchen with a candle in your hand and itched my apron off my head, when you told me I'd been dreaming, when you wouldn't believe the noises." After this explosion, Affery put her apron into her mouth again, always keeping her hand on the window-sill and her knee on the window-seat, ready to cry out or jump out if her lord and master approached. Rigaud had not lost a word of this. "Aha!" he cried, lifting his eyebrows, folding his arms, and leaning back in his chair. "Assuredly, Madame Flintwitch is an oracle. How shall we interpret the oracle, you and I and the old intriguer? He said that you were not, and you burst out and stopped him. What was it you were not? What is it you are not? Say then, madame." Under this ferocious banter she sat breathing harder, and her mouth was disturbed. Her lips quivered and opened in spite of her utmost efforts to keep them still. "Come then, madame. Speak then. Our old intriguer said that you were not, and you stopped him. He was going to say that you were not what? I know already, but I want a little confidence from you. How then? You are not what? She tried again to repress herself, but broke out vehemently. Not Arthur's mother. Good, said Rigaud. You are amenable. With the set expression of her face all torn away by the explosion of her passion, and with a bursting from every rent feature of the smouldering fire so long pent up, she cried out, I will tell it myself. I will not hear it from your lips, and with the taint of your wickedness upon it. Since it must be seen, I will have it seen by the light I stood in. Not another word. Hear me? Unless you are a more obstinate and more persisting woman than even I know you to be, Mr. Flintwich interposed. You had better leave Mr. Rigaud, Mr. Blondois, Mr. Beelzebub to tell it in his own way. What does it signify when he knows all about it? He does not know all about it. He knows all he cares about it, Mr. Flintwich testily urged. He does not know me. What do you suppose he cares for you, you conceited woman? Said Mr. Flintwich. I'll tell you, Flintwich, I will speak. I'll tell you when it has come to this. I'll tell you with my own lips and will express myself throughout it. What? Have I suffered nothing in this room, no deprivation, no imprisonment, that I should condescend at last to contemplate myself in such a glass as that? Can you see him? Can you hear him? If your wife were 100 times the ingrate that she is, and if I were 1,000 times more hopeless than I am of inducing her to be silent if this man is silenced, I would tell it myself before I would bear the torment of hearing it from him. Rigaud pushed his chair a little back, pushed his legs out straight before him, and sat with his arms folded over against her. You do not know what it is, she went on, addressing him, to be brought up strictly and straightly, as I was so brought up. Mine was no light of youth of sinful gaiety and pleasure. Mine were days of wholesome repression, punishment, and fear. The corruption of our hearts, the evil of our ways, the curse that is upon us, the terrors that surround us, these were the themes of my childhood. They formed my character and filled me with an abhorrence of evildoers. When old Mr. Gilbert Clennam proposed his orphan nephew to my father for my husband, my father impressed upon me that his bringing up had been, like mine, one of severe restraint. He told me that besides the discipline his spirit had undergone, he had lived in a starved house where rioting and gaiety were unknown, and where every day was a day of toil and trial like the last. He told me that he had been a man in years long before his uncle had acknowledged him as one, and that from his school days to that hour his uncle's roof had been a sanctuary to him from the contagion of the irreligious and dissolute. When, within a 12-month of our marriage, I found my husband, at that time when my father spoke of him, to have sinned against the Lord and outraged me by holding a guilty creature in my place, was I to doubt that it had been appointed to me to make the discovery, and that it was appointed to me to lay the hand of punishment upon that creature of perdition? Was I to dismiss in a moment, not my own wrongs? What was I, but all the rejection of sin and all the war against it in which I had been bred? She laid her wrathful hand upon the watch on the table. No, do not forget. The initials of those words are within here now, and were within here then. I was appointed to find the old letter that referred to them, and that told me what they meant, and whose work they were, and why they were worked, lying with this watch in his secret drawer. But for that appointment there would have been no discovery. Do not forget. It spoke to me like a voice from an angry cloud. Do not forget the deadly sin. Do not forget the appointed discovery. Do not forget the appointed suffering. I did not forget. Was it my own wrong I remembered? Mine? I was but a servant and a minister. What power could I have over them, but they were bound in the bonds of their sin and delivered to me? More than 40 years had passed over the grey head of this determined woman since the time she recalled. More than 40 years of strife and struggle with the whisper that, by whatever name she called her vindictive pride and rage, nothing through all eternity could change their nature. Yet, gone those more than 40 years, and come this nemesis now looking her in the face, she still abided by her old impiety, still reversed the order of creation, and breathed her own breath into a clay image of her Creator. Verily, verily, travellers have seen many monstrous idols in many countries, but no human eyes have ever seen more daring, gross, and shocking images of the divine nature than we creatures of the dust make in our own likenesses of our own bad passions. When I forced him to give her up to me by her name and place of abode, she went on in her torrent of indignation and defence, when I accused her and she fell hiding her face at my feet, was it my injury that I asserted? Were they my reproaches that I poured upon her? Those who were appointed of old to go to wicked kings and accuse them, were they not ministers and servants? And had not I, unworthy and far removed from them, sin to denounce? When she pleaded to me her youth and his wretched and hard life, that was her phrase for the virtuous training he had belied, and the desecrated ceremony of marriage there had secretly been between them, and the terrors of want and shame that had overwhelmed them both when I was first appointed to the instrument of their punishment, and the love, for she said the word to me down at my feet, in which she had abandoned him and left him to me. Was it my enemy that became my footstool? Were they the words of my wrath that made her shrink and quiver? Not unto me the strength be ascribed, not unto me the wringing of the expiation. Many years had come and gone since she had had the free use even of her fingers, but it was noticeable that she had already more than once struck her clenched hand vigorously upon the table, and that when she said these words she raised her whole arm in the air as though it had been a common action with her. And what was the repentance that was extorted from the hardness of her heart and the blackness of her depravity? Ay, vindictive and implacable, it may be so, to such as you who know no righteousness and no appointment except Satan's. Laugh, but I will be known as I know myself, and as Flintwich knows me, though it is only to you and this half-witted woman. Add to yourself, madame, said Rigaud. I have my little suspicions that madame is rather solicitous to be justified to herself. It is false. It is not so. I have no need to be, she said, with great energy and anger. Truly? Retorted Rigaud. Ha! I ask what was the penitence in works that was demanded of her? You have a child, I have none. You love that child. Give him to me. You shall believe himself to be my son, and he shall be believed by everyone to be my son. To save you from exposure, his father shall swear never to see or communicate with you more. Equally, to save him from being stripped by his uncle, and to save your child from being a beggar, you shall swear never to see or communicate with either of them more. That done, and your present means derived from my husband renounced, I charge myself with your support. You may, with your place of retreat unknown, then leave, if you please, uncontradicted by me, the lie that when you passed out of all knowledge but mine, you merited a good name. That was all. She had to sacrifice her sinful and shameful affections no more. She was then free to bear her load of guilt in secret, and to break her heart in secret, and through such present misery, light enough for her, I think, to purchase her redemption from endless misery if she could. If in this I punished her here, did I not open to her a way hereafter? If she knew herself to be surrounded by insatiable vengeance and unquenchable fires, were they mine? If I threatened her then and afterwards with the terrors that encompassed her, did I hold them in my right hand? She turned the watch upon the table and opened it, and, with an unsoftening face, looked at the worked letters within. They did not forget. It is appointed against such offences that the offenders shall not be able to forget. If the presence of Arthur was a daily reproach to his father, and if the absence of Arthur was a daily agony to his mother, that was the just dispensation of Jehovah. As well it might be charged upon me that the strings of an awakened conscience drove her mad, and that it was the will of the disposer of all things that she should live so many years. I devoted myself to reclaim the otherwise predestined and lost boy, to give him the reputation of an honest origin, to bring him up in fear and trembling, and in a little of practical contrition for the sins that were heavy on his head before his entrance into this condemned world. Was that a cruelty? Was I, too, not visited with consequences of the original offence in which I had no complicity? Arthur's father and I lived no further apart, with half the globe between us, than when we were together in this house. He died and sent this watch back to me, with its "Do not forget." I do not forget, though I do not read it as he did. I read in it that I was appointed to do these things. I have so read these 3 letters since I have had them lying on this table, and I did so read them with equal distinctness when they were thousands of miles away. As she took the watch-case in her hand, with that new freedom in the use of her hand of which she showed no consciousness whatever, bending her eyes upon it as if she were defying it to move her, Rigaud cried with a loud and contemptuous snapping of his fingers, "Come, madame, time runs out. Come, lady of piety it must be. You can tell nothing I don't know. Come to the money stolen, or I will. Death of my soul, I have had enough of your other jargon. Come straight to the stolen money." "Wretch that you are," she answered, and now her hands clasped her head. Through what fatal error of Flintwinch's, through what incompleteness on his part, who was the only other person helping in these things and trusted with them, through whose and what bringing together of the ashes of a burnt paper, you have become possessed of that codicil? I know no more than how you acquired the rest of your power here." "And yet," interrupted Rigaud, "it is my odd fortune to have by me, in a convenient piece that I know of, that same short little addition to the will of Monsieur Gilbert Clenham, written by a lady and witnessed by the same lady, and our old intriguer. Ah, bah, old intriguer, crooked little puppet. Madame, let us go on. Time presses. You or I to finish?" "I," she answered, with increased determination, if it were possible. "I, because I will not endure to be shown myself, and have myself shown to anyone, with your horrible distortion upon me. You, with your practices of infamous foreign prisons and galleys, would make it the money that impelled me. It was not the money. Bah, bah, bah. I repudiate for the moment my politeness and say, lies, lies, lies. You know you suppressed the deed and kept the money." "Not for the money's sake, wretch." She made a struggle as if she were starting up, even as if, in her vehemence, she had almost risen on her disabled feet. If Gilbert Clenham, reduced to imbecility at the point of death, and labouring under the delusion of some imaginary relenting towards a girl of whom he had heard that his nephew had once had a fancy for her, which he had crushed out of him, and that she afterwards drooped away into melancholy and withdrawal from all who knew her, if, in that state of weakness, he dictated to me, whose life, if she had darkened with her sin, and who had been appointed to know her wickedness from her own hand and her own lips, a bequest meant as a recompense to her for supposed unmerited suffering? Was there no difference between my spurning that injustice and coveting mere money, a thing which you and your comrades in the prisons may steal from anyone? Time presses, madame. Take care. If this house was blazing from the roof to the ground, she returned, I would stay in it to justify myself against my righteous motives being classed with those of stabbers and thieves. Rigaud snapped his fingers tauntingly in her face. 1,000 guineas to the little beauty you slowly hunted to death. 1,000 guineas to the youngest daughter her patron might have at 50, or, if he had none, brother's youngest daughter, on her coming of age, as the remembrance his disinterestedness may like best of his protection of a friendless young orphan girl. 2,000 guineas. What? You will never come to the money? That patron? She was vehemently proceeding when he checked her. Names. Call him Mr. Frederick Dorrit. No more evasions. That Frederick Dorrit was the beginning of it all. If he had not been a player of music, and had not kept in those days of his youth and prosperity an idle house where singers and players and such like children of evil turned their backs on the light and their faces to the darkness, she might have remained in her lowly station, and might not have been raised out of it to be cast down. But no, Satan entered into that Frederick Dorrit, and counselled him there is a man of innocent and laudable tastes who did kind actions, and that here was a poor girl with a voice for singing music with. Then he is to have her taught. Then Arthur's father, who has all along been secretly pining the ways of virtuous ruggedness for those accursed snares which are called the arts, becomes acquainted with her. And so a graceless orphan, training to be a singing girl, carries it, by that Frederick Dorrit's agency, against me, and I am humbled and deceived. Not I, that is to say, she added quickly as colour flushed into her face, a greater than I. What am I? Jeremiah Flintwich, who had been gradually screwing himself towards her, and who was now very near her elbow without her knowing it, made a specially wry face of objection when she said these words, and moreover twitched his gaiters as if such pretensions were equivalent to little barbs in his legs. Lastly, she continued, for I am at the end of these things, and I will say no more of them, and you shall say no more of them, and all that remains will be to determine whether the knowledge of them can be kept among us who are here present. Lastly, when I suppressed that paper with the knowledge of Arthur's father— But not with his consent, you know, said Mr. Flintwich. Who said with his consent? She started to find Jeremiah so near her, and drew back her head, looking at him with some rising distrust. You were often between us when he would have had me produce it and I would not, to have contradicted me if I had said with his consent. I say, when I suppressed that paper I made no effort to destroy it, but kept it by me, here in this house, many years. The rest of the Gilbert property being left to Arthur's father, I could at any time, without unsettling more than the two sums, have made a pretence of finding it. But, besides that I must have supported such pretence by a direct falsehood, a great responsibility, I have seen no reason in all the time I have been tried here to bring it to light. It was a rewarding of sin, the wrong result of a delusion. I did what I was appointed to do, and I have undergone, within these four walls, what I was appointed to undergo. When the paper was at last destroyed, as I thought, in my presence, she had long been dead, and her patron, Frederick Dorrit, had long been deservedly ruined and imbecile. He had no daughter. I had found the niece before then, and what I did for her was far better for her far than the money of which she would have had no good. She added, after a moment, as though she addressed the watch. She herself was innocent, and I might not have forgotten to relinquish it to her at my death, and sat looking at it. Shall I recall something to you, worthy madame? Said Rigaud. The little paper was in this house on the night when our friend the prisoner, a jail comrade of my soul, came home from foreign countries. Shall I recall yet something more to you? The little singing bird that never was fledged was long kept in a cage by a guardian of your appointing, well enough known to our old intriguer here. Shall we coax our old intriguer to tell us when he saw him last?" "I'll tell you," cried Affery, unstopping her mouth. "I dreamed it, first of all my dreams. Jeremiah, if you come anigh me now, I'll scream to be heard at St. Paul's. The person as this man has spoken of was Jeremiah's own twin brother, and he was here in the dead of night,